Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to cut through the noise and get straight to the crucial insights you need to understand the world around you.
That's the goal.
And today, we're plunging into a truly dramatic, very complex sequence of events that recently unfolded in the Middle East.
Absolutely. A lot happened very quickly.
If I had to sum up this whole chapter in one incredibly concise phrase, it might be something like 14 precision bombs brought an end to a rapid 12-day conflict.
That's a stark way to put it, but yeah, it captures the essence. What we're dissecting today is this intense, very recent escalation between Israel and Iran.
Which was then swiftly followed by significant, high-stakes U.S. intervention.
Right. And then, almost surprisingly, a very fragile ceasefire emerged.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really pull apart the complex layers of this conflict. We'll be meticulously focusing on the specific airstrikes, the incredibly precise and costly U.S. bombing campaign.
And crucially, the far-reaching, often quite subtle implications for regional stability that are, still rippling outwards even now.
Our promise, as always, is to give you that vital shortcut to being thoroughly well-informed. We aim to offer surprising facts, critical insights, but without overwhelming you with the usual information overload.
Yeah, avoiding noise.
Exactly. By the time we wrap up this deep dive, you'll not only understand the key players and their sort of immediate motivations, but you'll also grasp that deeper. So what the true significance of these pivotal events.
Okay, so to really set the stage for you, it all kicked off quite abruptly, dramatically even, on June 13th.
Right, that was the start date.
That was the day Israel launched its initial strikes on Iran. Now, the stated reason, the primary justification Israel gave, was its escalating concern over Iran's alleged development of nuclear weapons.
There were reports circulating suggesting Iran was, months away?
Purportedly months away from building a functional warhead, yeah. So Israel's explicit aim with these strikes was stated as nothing less than to destroy Iran's nuclear potential, a very ambitious goal.
But here's where the strategic calculus immediately became incredibly complicated. Iran hadn't just been, sitting idly by, passively waiting for something like this.
Not at all. For years leading up to this, they had implemented significant countermeasures. We're talking a massive engineering undertaking to move their most critical uranium enrichment facilities deep underground.
Right, I remember reading about that. Tunnels, workshops.
Exactly. They'd constructed this elaborate network of tunnels and workshops, literally hundreds of meters deep, burrowed into mountainous regions, specifically designed to protect these assets from aerial attacks.
It was clear foresight, wasn't it? Anticipating exactly this kind of scenario.
Precisely. And that foresight fundamentally changed the strategic calculus for Israel. While Israel certainly boasts considerable aerial superiority in the region, they have a modern, capable air force.
But they hit a wall, technically speaking.
They did. They faced a critical technical limitation. Their arsenal simply lacked the specialized bunker buster munitions, the kind of ordnance you need to penetrate facilities buried so far beneath the Earth's surface.
So after a week of hitting them.
After a full week of Israeli airstrikes, the assessments began to trickle in. And both Israeli military experts and, interestingly, independent UN inspectors arrived at a similar, quite stark conclusion.
Which was?
Only the surface buildings at Iran's main nuclear research site, Natanz, had been destroyed. Crucially, the vital underground workshops where the actual enrichment was happening remained largely intact.
In Fordo, that was another key site, right? Even deeper.
Fordo suffered even less verifiable damage according to those initial reports. It was even more heavily fortified.
So given these pretty severe technical shortcomings and basically the inability to achieve their stated objective.
Well, it's hardly surprising then that Israel began relentlessly urging the U.S. government, starting as early as June 13th, the very first day,
to get involved directly.
To directly participate in strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. They understood, probably more acutely than anyone, that the U.S. possessed the unique, superior capabilities for this very specific, highly specialized kind of deep penetration attack.
They were essentially saying, we've hit a limit. You have the tools to finish this.
That seems to be the message, yes. What's truly fascinating, though, is how the Trump administration initially responded to this increasingly urgent call for intervention.
Yeah, it wasn't an immediate yes.
No, their attitude was noticeably hesitant, almost ambivalent, you could say. It wasn't a clear yes or no right away. On one hand, starting around June 16th, U.S. military reinforcements, naval forces, air forces began deploying to the Middle East.
And there was some strong rhetoric, too.
Oh, yeah, very strong. These movements were accompanied by aggressive rhetoric, including public threats for Iran to surrender unconditionally. That definitely signaled preparation for action.
Yet almost simultaneously, and this seemed quite contradictory.
It did. By June 19th, Trump publicly stated that he would give Iran 2 full weeks to decide between compromise and outright resistance before he would even consider significant military action.
This kind of dragging strategy, as it's sometimes called, it feels familiar with Trump's foreign policy.
It's not new for him, absolutely. We've certainly seen this approach play out before. You could look at his attempts to mediate the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where he tried to push for negotiations rather than committing U.S. forces directly.
Or even in trade disputes, right? Trying to force the other side's hand.
Exactly. The underlying goal often appears to be encouraging self-resolution, hoping to avoid direct U.S. involvement and, the associated financial and human costs. It's a calculated gamble, exert pressure without fully committing.
But that gamble didn't last long this time.
You've hit on it. In this specific instance, Trump's dragging strategy, his calculated delay, lasted less than 3 days. The situation shifted from that initial ambivalence to decisive action with astonishing speed.
And that led to Operation Midnight Hammer.
Correct. In the early morning hours of June 21st, local time in the central United States, 7 U.S. Air Force B-2 stealth bombers, those incredibly distinctive bat-wing-shaped aircraft, took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri.
All the way from Missouri, heading east across the Atlantic towards Iran.
That's right. This was the silent, almost invisible beginning of what we now know as Operation Midnight Hammer.
And these weren't short flights. These weren't missions launched from, say, a base in Qatar or somewhere nearby.
Not at all. To reach their distant targets, these bombers spent nearly 19 hours in the air. That required at least one mid-air refueling, which is a complex, precise maneuver in itself.
19 hours.
They finally arrived over Iran on June 22nd, around 3 a.m. local time. Now, 6 of those B-2s were specifically tasked with striking the Fordo nuclear facility.
The deeply buried one.
Yes. They dropped a total of 12 GBU-57 bunker buster bombs there. The 7th B-2 veered off to target Natanz, deploying 2 more of these monstrous bunker busters at that site.
And it wasn't just to bombers, was it?
No, simultaneously, to maximize the impact and hit multiple locations at once, the USS Georgia nuclear submarine, which had been operating covertly in the Middle East,
A sub-launch.
launched 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles. These were directed at Iran's nuclear technology center in Isfahan, specifically hitting centrifuge factories and workshops crucial for uranium metal reduction.
What's really striking about this whole thing, considering the scale and the stealth involved,
Is that throughout this entire complex, multi-pronged attack, Iranian air defenses apparently did not intercept any of the U.S. attacks. Not a single B-2 or cruise missile was reported brought down.
that's a huge statement about U.S. capabilities versus Iranian defenses at that moment.
It is. Once their missions were complete, the B-2s immediately turned around, completed the roughly 18-hour return flight back to base, bringing Operation Midnight Hammer to a close. It was a powerful demonstration of stealth, precision, and frankly, overwhelming air superiority.
Looking at the sheer scale of the assets deployed, okay, 7 bombers, 1 submarine, 14 specialized bombs, 30 cruise missiles. You might initially think, well, that sounds relatively small compared to the week-long continuous air campaign Israel had conducted with over 200 aircraft.
Right, the numbers seem smaller.
But the technical sophistication and, let's be honest, the immense cost involved in this single U.S. cross-continental airstrike were truly monumental. Let's talk about those GBU-57 bunker buster bombs. They aren't just any old ordnance.
They certainly are not. The GBU-57, often called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, it's an engineering marvel designed for one purpose: extreme penetration.
How massive are we talking?
Each one weighs a colossal 14 tons. To give you a sense of scale, that's roughly the weight of 2 adult male African elephants.
14 tons. Wow.
They have an incredibly high-density alloy casing designed to withstand immense impact forces and a relatively small but incredibly powerful 2-kilogram polymer explosive warhead inside.
And their key feature, penetration.
Exactly. What makes them so unique and terrifyingly effective is their ability to penetrate up to 60 meters. That's nearly 200 feet of standard concrete.
Okay, and the cost. You mentioned cost.
The cost. Each single bomb had a procurement price tag of around $13 million.
$13 million for one bomb.
$13 million. That's a staggering figure for a single piece of ammunition.
So that raises a really important question. If Iran's underground facilities are described as being hundreds of meters deep, maybe 200, 300 meters, and these bombs can only penetrate 60 meters.
Right, how could they possibly be effective? It sounds like a mismatch.
Exactly. To an outsider, it sounds almost futile. Was this really about physical destruction deep down, or was it more about sending a powerful psychological message? Or something else?
That's where the meticulous precision targeting strategy comes into play. And it really leans heavily into both physical disruption and psychological impact. The U.S. military, they had spent considerable time studying high-resolution satellite photos, gathering intelligence on these facilities.
They knew they couldn't just drill straight down.
Right. They knew direct, linear penetration to hundreds of meters wasn't feasible with these bombs in a single hit. So instead of trying to go straight through meters and meters of rock and reinforced concrete,
they aimed smarter.
They targeted the most vulnerable points, the ventilation shafts. These shafts are absolutely crucial for the underground complexes to operate air, power, access, and critically, they extend all the way down to the deepest sections where the centrifuges and other sensitive equipment are housed.
Ah, okay, so hitting the shafts?
The idea was that accurate hits on these shafts could cause significant cascading damage, not just from the direct explosion, but by collapsing the shafts, cutting off power lines running alongside them, blocking communication, stopping vital airflow, essentially making the deep chambers unusable. Furthermore, the decision to drop 12 bombs specifically on Fordo wasn't just about hoping one hits the right spot. It was likely a sophisticated sequential targeting strategy.
Like chiseling down, as some reports put it.
Exactly, aiming to chisel down the protective layers. Or perhaps more importantly, create massive vibrations deep underground. Those vibrations alone could destroy delicate centrifuges by shaking them violently off their mountings. Or cause widespread power outages, effectively crippling operations, even if the centrifuges themselves weren't directly hit.
And the cruise missiles from the sub.
They played their part too. The Tomahawks targeted the centrifuge factories and the uranium metal reduction workshops back in Isfahan, hitting the supply chain, essentially. Critical components for producing the fissile material in the first place.
So while Midnight Hammer might have seemed limited in the number of aircraft involved,
its technical sophistication, the detailed tactical planning, and the sheer cost were exceptionally high. It was designed for maximum disruption short of needing a full-scale ground invasion, which nobody wanted.
It really brings that old saying to life, doesn't it? When the guns roar, gold flows.
It certainly does.
To put the cost into even starker perspective, you mentioned Israel's initial strikes. Their daily fuel and munition costs for their 200-plus aircraft running constant operations for a week were estimated at approximately $300 million per day.
Right, a huge burn rate.
But the 14 GBU-57 bombs alone used by the U.S. in Operation Midnight Hammer, those cost nearly $200 million just for the bombs.
Almost $250 million for 14 shots.
It's an almost unimaginable expense, and it vividly illustrates the economics of modern high-tech warfare.
And of course, with U.S. aircraft striking so deep into Iranian territory using such powerful weapons, a response from Iran was absolutely inevitable. Politically, they had to respond.
But the response was interesting.
It was. What was particularly interesting and a crucial signal for analysts watching closely was the delay. Iran's counterattack didn't come immediately. It arrived a full day and a half later on the evening of June 23rd.
And the scale.
The scale and nature of this response were also quite contained, quite calculated. The U.S. had dropped 14 bunker busters. Iran responded by launching
14 missiles.
14 ballistic missiles, yes, aimed at the U.S. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, strategically matching the number of bombs received. This response was widely interpreted by military analysts almost immediately as more symbolic than military in its actual intent. It wasn't designed to inflict heavy damage or casualties.
And there's that crucial detail about the warning they gave.
Absolutely. This really highlights Iran's underlying intent. Signal resilience, show they can strike back, but avoid escalating into an all-out regional war, especially with the U.S. Qatari media reported that Iran actually gave Qatar advance warning of the missile launches.
Which allowed precautions.
Exactly. It allowed Qatar to proactively close its airspace, evacuate civilians from the vicinity of the base, and crucially inform the U.S. military to shelter their aircraft in hardened bunkers.
So the result was no damage.
The result, no casualties reported, no significant damage to U.S. personnel or vital equipment. This deliberate pre-notified response is eerily reminiscent of Iran's actions after the 2020 Soleimani assassination.
Right, when they hit bases in Iraq but gave warning.
Same playbook. Launch missiles at U.S. bases, but provide enough warning to avoid fatalities. It's a very specific, calculated tactic to say, essentially, we can reach you, we will respond, but we don't want a full-scale war right now.
Following Iran's carefully orchestrated, symbolic counterattack, the geopolitical clock moved incredibly quickly again.
It did. Just 5 hours later, on the evening of June 23rd, U.S. Eastern Time, President Trump wasted absolutely no time. He went public.
Announcing a ceasefire?
Announcing that Israel and Iran had privately agreed to a formal ceasefire set to begin just 2 days later, on June 25th, thereby, supposedly, officially, bringing the intense 12-day conflict to an end.
But the ink was barely dry. Or maybe there wasn't even ink.
Perhaps not, because almost immediately conflicting information began to emerge from both Tehran and Jerusalem over the next crucial 6 hours. Iran's foreign minister quickly issued a statement claiming there was no written ceasefire agreement.
Just a conditional understanding.
Pretty much. Simply asserting that Iran would cease its missile launches if Israel stopped its airstrikes. It was a much more informal, almost conditional statement than Trump had implied.
And the fragility of this whole thing was immediately dramatically put to the test.
Oh, instantly. On the very next morning, June 24th, just hours after the ceasefire was supposed to be solidifying, Iran accused Israel of continuing drone strikes on Tehran, violating the nascent agreement.
And Iran responded.
Iran retaliated by launching more missiles. Israel, in turn, announced its own retaliation, confirming reports that its planes were already airborne, seemingly ready to restart the whole cycle of escalation.
This must have infuriated Trump.
Absolutely. This turn of events, a direct defiance of the truths he had just personally announced to the world, clearly infuriated him. He publicly castigated Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on social media using very direct language.
Telling him to return the planes.
Telling him to return the planes and not drop bombs, explicitly warning against ceasefire violations. He even went as far as to make a public phone call to Netanyahu from the White House, a highly unusual, very visible display of presidential anger and authority. It underscored just how critical this ceasefire was to him and his narrative.
Did it work? Did Netanyahu back down?
It appears that very public dressing down largely worked. Most Israeli planes did, in fact, return to base. Reports indicated only one anti-aircraft radar station was bombed before they turned around.
So the ceasefire held just barely.
Following that very tense moment, yes, the formal ceasefire finally took hold, halting the direct hostilities. Predictably, despite the extremely tense and contradictory moments right before the truce actually started, both sides subsequently claimed victory in the conflict.
Standard practice, really.
Interpreting the outcome in a way that served their own narratives and, importantly, their domestic political needs.
Okay, now that we've meticulously walked through that dramatic sequence of events, Israel's initial strikes, the limitations, the U.S. intervention, the counterstrike, the rocky path to a ceasefire, let's pivot. Let's turn our attention to the key takeaways.
Right. Distilling the deeper meaning.
This is where we try to understand the strategic implications. We've identified 3 crucial insights that really reshape our understanding of what happened behind the scenes.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the deep and, frankly, often surprising divisions within the U.S. administration regarding military intervention in the first place.
The internal politics. Always crucial.
Second, the vital reality, and this is huge, that the Iranian nuclear program was delayed. Significantly, perhaps, but absolutely not destroyed.
A critical distinction.
Yeah.
Delayed, not eliminated.
And third, how the U.S. and Israel's long-standing, often underlying disagreements resurfaced in a really dramatic fashion, specifically over the management of this ceasefire.
Okay, 3 big points. Let's delve into that first one.
Right.
The deep divisions within the U.S. administration.
Yeah, President Trump's core stance really throughout this year, and arguably for much of his political career, has been a deep reluctance to incur high financial and military costs, especially in the Middle East.
The America First instinct.
Exactly. He reiterated this stance quite clearly during his May visit to the region, remember? He openly criticized the Bush administration's interventions in the early 2000s, calling them failed, particularly condemning the idea of large troop deployments, costly nation-building, protracted ground wars.
His focus is different. Swift, decisive action, or ideally, broker a deal and avoid direct action altogether.
And when you look at his foreign policy decisions, particularly in these crisis moments, there seem to be 3 main overarching factors driving his considerations.
Okay.
First, it's about asserting his own presence, and by extension, the singular authority of the U.S. government as the pivotal player on the global stage.
The indispensable nation, or rather, indispensable leader.
Right. Whether it was his public claims about mediating Gaza or the Russia-Ukraine war, or now stepping in to broker this Iran-Israel truce. His interventions consistently aim to make himself the center of the event, the indispensable dealmaker. Success of the mediation itself is sometimes secondary to being seen as the one in charge.
It's a display of personal and national influence. What's the second factor?
The second factor, closely related, is his unwavering desire to minimize direct financial and human costs. He consistently aims to avoid those large troop deployments, those costly nation-building projects, the ground wars that bogged down previous administrations. It's about leveraging U.S. might without getting stuck.
Okay, presence and low cost. And the third?
And the third factor is his strong, almost visceral resistance to being manipulated or swayed by any single faction, whether that's domestic political groups or foreign allies. He doesn't want to be dragged into a situation that primarily serves someone else's agenda or incurs burdens that he sees as disproportionate to core U.S. interests.
Right, he wants to feel like he's in control of the decision, not being pushed into it.
Exactly. And this brings us to the internal divisions within the MAGA movement itself, which, according to some interesting analysis reported by The Atlantic, can be broadly categorized into three distinct factions regarding foreign policy.
Okay, who are they?
First, you have the staunch isolationists. These are figures like Vice President Vance, who's a prominent voice arguing for a significantly reduced U.S. global footprint. Also, former chief strategist Stephen Bannon, and maybe influential media voices like Tucker Carlson. Their argument is basically America first, focus inwards, minimize foreign entanglements.
Okay, the pullback faction.
Then there are the selective interventionists. This group is notably led, according to this analysis, by current Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Their belief system dictates that the U.S.'s core strategic interests lie primarily in the Indo-Pacific region. That's the main game.
So pivot to Asia, essentially.
Pretty much. Therefore, they advocate for a more disengaged approach from conflicts in places like Ukraine or the Middle East, viewing them as secondary distractions from that main strategic imperative.
And the third group? The opposite end of the spectrum.
Exactly. The hardline full interventionists, represented by figures like the current CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla. He's the top U.S. military commander for the Middle East, and influential conservative commentators like Mark Levin. This faction advocates for a strong, direct, often immediate military approach whenever U.S. interests are perceived to be at stake. They believe in projecting power decisively.
So you have isolationists, selective interventionists focused elsewhere, and full-on interventionists ready to act. That's quite a spread.
It is. And these internal divisions became incredibly relevant and intensely active as this Iran conflict unfolded. From June 13th, as soon as Israel signaled, hey, we can't destroy these underground facilities, and subtly hinted that direct U.S. help was needed.
The lobbying started.
These three factions engaged in intense, high-stakes lobbying of President Trump for that entire week, each group pushing its own agenda, its own recommendation for how the U.S. should proceed.
And at the same time, Netanyahu was applying pressure directly.
Immense pressure. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was also heavily lobbying Trump, reportedly even delivering what was described as a final deadline during a tense video conference on June 19th.
Wow. What was Israel's core argument to compel U.S. action?
Israel's argument was stark, and it was designed to force Trump's hand. Essentially, if Israel's current limited actions ultimately provoke Iran into retaliating massively across the region, mining the Strait of Hormuz, hitting Saudi oil fields, things Israel couldn't contain alone,
then the U.S. would have to get involved anyway.
Exactly. The U.S. would inevitably have to step in later to clean up a much bigger, more catastrophic regional mess. So Trump faced this critical, almost binary decision point.
Let Israel keep going and risk a wider war later.
Or conduct a precise, limited U.S. strike now, knowing it would likely incur immediate but hopefully contained direct Iranian retaliation. It was a choice between a potentially bigger delayed indirect risk and a sharp, immediate direct one.
A classic foreign policy dilemma.
So, despite his public statements about waiting 2 weeks, we know Trump was consulting intensely behind the scenes, especially over those critical days from June 19th to 21st. And what's remarkable is how it played out.
Two factions aligned?
Ultimately, yes. Two of those three factions, the selective interventionists, led by Secretary Rubio, and the hardline interventionists, represented by CENTCOM Commander Kurilla, actually aligned their views on this specific issue. They managed to convince Trump to act decisively with Midnight Hammer.
What were their key arguments that swayed him?
They made several key points that were apparently very persuasive and, in hindsight, proved quite accurate. First, they argued that Israel's initial week of airstrikes, despite not destroying the underground bunkers, had largely succeeded in crippling Iran's conventional air defenses.
Making it safer for U.S. planes.
Exactly. It made subsequent U.S. surgical strikes significantly less risky, as the B-2s would face minimal effective resistance getting in and out. Second, and this was crucial,
Iran's reaction so far.
they pointed to Iran's limited and highly symbolic retaliation in that first week, mainly those ballistic missiles aimed at Israeli cities, but crucially, no direct provocation of U.S. forces. They interpreted this as a clear indication that Iran, despite its rhetoric, really desired to avoid a full-scale direct war with the United States.
They didn't want to poke the bear directly.
That was the assessment. Therefore, they concluded that a focused U.S. strike only on nuclear facilities explicitly avoiding government buildings or leadership assassinations would likely elicit a restrained Iranian response.
Which is pretty much what happened with the Al Udeid strike.
Exactly. Their calibrated assessment turned out to be remarkably accurate.
So for President Trump, this limited intervention likely looked like a win-win, or at least the best available option.
It probably seemed like a relatively ideal outcome from his perspective. It allowed the U.S. to dramatically recenter itself as the primary indispensable actor in Middle East affairs, influencing both Israeli and Iranian next steps, effectively forcing a de-escalation on his terms.
And crucially, at a perceived low cost.
A remarkably low cost compared to past interventions, a few $100 million, less than 2 days of direct military engagement. A stark contrast to the multi-year, multi-trillion-dollar campaigns of the past.
It fits his model. Quick, decisive, U.S.-led, relatively cheap.
It does, but it presents a fascinating paradox, doesn't it? Does this kind of low-cost, precise intervention inadvertently set a precedent? Could it encourage other regional powers, when their own capabilities fall short, to try and push the U.S. into similar short, sharp interventions to solve their problems?
That's a really good question. It's a strategic win that potentially opens a deeper, more complex dynamic about dependency and the future of U.S. influence and when it gets deployed.
Definitely something to watch. Okay, let's move to our second key takeaway, which has huge implications for global non-proliferation efforts. The Iranian nuclear program was delayed, yes, but emphatically not destroyed.
This is absolutely critical to understand. The U.S. Department of Defense's own preliminary assessment, which was quickly leaked to major news outlets like CNN and the Washington Post on June 24th, confirmed serious damage to Iran's 3 main nuclear facilities. So Midnight Hammer definitely had a significant impact.
Yeah.
But, and this is the crucial caveat in their own assessment, it explicitly stated that Iran's nuclear potential was not completely destroyed. This wasn't a mission accomplished moment in terms of ending their nuclear ambitions entirely, not even close.
And this assessment aligns with warnings we've heard from other sources, too.
It aligns perfectly with a critical, ongoing warning coming from multiple independent bodies, the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, and also intelligence analysts from Israel. Their collective concern zeroes in on a very specific, very alarming detail.
The missing uranium.
The missing uranium.
Yep.
Iran's stockpile of approximately 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which is widely considered a critical mass, potentially usable for warheads, remains entirely unaccounted for. It simply vanished from its previously monitored locations.
400 kilograms. That sounds like a lot. Is it hard to move?
You'd think so, but this quantity of highly enriched uranium, while strategically significant, is remarkably easy to transport and hide. That's what makes verification so challenging. 400 kilograms can apparently be stored in less than 20 specialized gas cylinders.
Small enough for trucks.
Easily transportable by a few trucks or even ordinary SUVs, according to analysts. It doesn't require massive, obvious infrastructure to move it.
And there was suspicious activity reported.
There was. Satellite photos taken on June 19th and 20th, just before Midnight Hammer struck, showed vehicles clustered near the entrances to the Fordo facility. This raised immediate suspicions that they might have been loading critical materials for removal just ahead of the anticipated U.S. strike.
So the U.S. caused damage, but couldn't confirm if the crucial material was even still there.
Precisely. While the U.S. military certainly caused significant damage to the underground infrastructure, there was no ground verification possible. No inspectors went in. So they couldn't confirm the true extent of the damage deep inside, or, critically, the presence or absence of that missing enriched uranium.
And Iran's official line,
Iran, for its part, has maintained a stony silence on the whereabouts of the uranium. They only vaguely stated that no radioactive leakage occurred during the strikes, which cleverly sidesteps the core issue of where the enriched material went.
The implication here is huge for regional and global security.
It's profoundly significant. If that critical uranium stock remains intact and hidden somewhere, then destroying centrifuges and production facilities, while an important setback for Iran, only delays their nuclear program, maybe by a few months, maybe longer, but it's a delay.
Because they can rebuild.
They possess the knowledge, the blueprints, and potentially now the secured material. They can quickly rebuild and reassemble centrifuges and simply resume enrichment once the immediate threat subsides and the facilities are repaired or replaced.
So this is clearly not the ideal outcome for either Israel or the U.S.
Not at all. Not for Israel, whose primary goal is to completely neutralize Iran's nuclear capability, and not for the U.S., which seeks global non-proliferation. This reality absolutely necessitates continued, robust diplomatic engagement, however frustrating or difficult it might be, to manage the situation and prevent a full-blown Iranian nuclear breakout down the line. The military option didn't solve the core problem.
Okay, brings us to our third key takeaway. The dramatic resurfacing of those deep-seated U.S.-Israel disagreements, particularly visible in how the ceasefire itself was managed.
Yeah, the friction became very public.
We talked about President Trump's 4 core motivations: asserting final say, ensuring U.S. presence, keeping costs low, resisting manipulation. It seems pretty evident that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's actions, especially right after the U.S. strike, often clashed directly with these motivations, almost like he was testing the limits.
It certainly looked that way. It's clear that Netanyahu has been deeply, perhaps singularly, motivated by his own precarious political situation back home. After the devastating October 7th Gaza attacks and the prolonged, costly Gaza conflict that followed, he's been facing immense domestic pressure, plummeting approval ratings.
He needed a win politically.
He desperately needed to rebuild his political image as a strong leader, a hero, maybe regain some political prestige through decisive action against Iran, the archenemy. His very ambitious, publicly stated goals, destroying the Iranian regime entirely, even assassinating Supreme Leader Khamenei.
Those are huge goals.
They are highly expensive goals, financially, militarily, and in terms of international political capital. There's a very strong indication, reading between the lines of the diplomatic traffic, that Israel, unable or unwilling to bear these immense costs alone, intended to effectively drag the U.S. down to share these burdens, to make it a joint long-term project.
Which clashes directly with Trump's low-cost and no-manipulation drivers.
Directly. And this brings us to what looks like attempted manipulation, a calculated affront to U.S. efforts right at the critical moment. Israel's decision to conduct drone attacks on Tehran after President Trump had personally, publicly announced a truce.
And then to announce immediate retaliation with planes already in the air.
That was a direct, almost undeniable attempt to undermine Trump's carefully orchestrated effort. He had worked, maybe behind the scenes, maybe through sheer force of will, to regain global attention, assert his role as the decisive mediator, the central figure who ended the conflict.
And Netanyahu's actions threatened to pull the spotlight back to Israel.
Exactly. They threatened to shift the global focus right back to Israel's ongoing conflict with Iran, effectively bypassing Trump's authority just hours after he'd claimed it. This absolutely infuriated him, as we saw in that very public rebuke. It was a clear power play, and one that Trump was clearly not going to tolerate.
Okay, so we've analyzed the events, the takeaways. Let's pivot now and look ahead. What are the prospects for this fragile ceasefire actually lasting? What conditions are typically needed for a sustained truce? And what are the broader implications for the Middle East moving forward?
It's the crucial question, isn't it? Historically, if you look at conflict resolution patterns, unsupervised ceasefires, ones that aren't followed up by serious political negotiation or sustained diplomatic engagement, they rarely last long. They often just become temporary pauses before hostilities resume.
So what makes a truce stick?
For a long-term, genuinely successful truce to hold, analysts usually point to 3 key features being present, almost invariably. First, it requires moving beyond just stopping the shooting, beyond military disengagement, to actually address the underlying political and diplomatic issues that fuel the conflict in the first place.
Getting to the root causes.
Exactly. This means creating robust dialogue mechanisms, building buffers, addressing the core grievances, not just patching up the immediate damage. It's about building a new foundation, not just repairing the cracks.
And international supervision, you mentioned that earlier.
Absolutely crucial. That's the second key feature. Research on ceasefires consistently shows that external oversight and monitoring significantly increase the probability of success, often by as much as 20%.
How does that help, practically?
Well, a neutral monitoring body, for instance, can provide objective evidence and explanations when violations are alleged by either side. This transparency creates public pressure on both sides to stick to the agreement, and, critically, it deters rash military action because both sides know their actions are being watched by impartial observers. It acts like an umpire, reducing the chances of misunderstandings or deliberate provocations escalating. And the third feature, something about a window.
Yes, the third is a concept often called the vulnerability window. The first 100 days or so following a ceasefire are statistically the most critical period for its long-term viability.
The make-or-break period.
Pretty much. If small-scale incidents during this initial delicate phase clashes, minor violations cause fewer than, say, 25 deaths in total within those first 100 days, the ceasefire is significantly more likely to succeed and hold for a longer duration. It suggests a level of restraint is taking hold.
So putting it all together for this specific ceasefire.
Its long-term viability really hinges heavily on two things: sustained international intervention, likely U.S.-led, given our earlier discussion, to provide that crucial supervision, and perhaps even more importantly, the genuine willingness of both Israel and Iran to engage in actual political dialogue that tackles the core issues, not just the military standoff. Without those elements, it remains highly precarious. Just a pause.
And even with a temporary truce in place, the mid to long-term contradictions between Iran and Israel, they haven't gone away.
Not at all. They remain incredibly sharp and deeply entrenched. You could argue both sides currently need this respite, but for entirely different strategic reasons. That creates a very fragile equilibrium.
Talk about Iran's need first. Why do they need this pause?
For Iran, Operation Midnight Hammer was a wake-up call. It revealed profound vulnerabilities. Its air defenses were largely destroyed or proven ineffective against advanced stealth attacks, leaving major cities and vital military facilities dangerously exposed to potential future strikes.
And their decision-making.
Their top-down military decision-making system also seemed partly incapacitated, or at least severely stressed, by the speed and depth of the U.S. strikes. So for Iran, this ceasefire was an absolutely necessary breathing room, a chance to reassess what happened, regroup their forces, rebuild defenses, and rethink their strategy.
Okay, and on Israel's side, why did they agree to stop, especially if Netanyahu wanted a bigger win?
Well, by the second week of its initial air campaign before the U.S. stepped in, Israel was already experiencing what military analysts call significantly reduced marginal returns. They'd hit the easier targets. Air power alone, as history has shown repeatedly, is highly unlikely to achieve the incredibly ambitious goal of overthrowing a regime governing 90 million people. That requires more than airstrikes.
And the missile defense issue.
That's another key factor. While Israel's missile interception rate during the conflict was remarkably high, 94%, a testament to Iron Dome and other systems, 6% of nearly 1,000 incoming Iranian missiles, still meant about 60 successful hits on Israeli territory.
60 hits is not insignificant.
Not at all. At least 20 hits were publicly acknowledged by Israel, and they caused over 800 injuries to civilians. And crucially, Israel's anti-missile systems rely on interceptors, which are incredibly expensive and not endlessly available. As that stock depletes in a prolonged conflict, the interception success rate could potentially fall. That's a bad sign for Israel's long-term defensive posture against a determined adversary.
So both sides had reasons to pause, but the core conflict remains.
Exactly. Both sides welcome this truce, for now, for their own tactical reasons. But the deep-seated conflicts haven't vanished, especially given Netanyahu's continued public calls for outright regime change in Iran, including, astonishingly, the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei himself. That kind of rhetoric doesn't suggest long-term peace is the goal.
This brings us back to the role of external powers. It seems mediation is essential, but who can actually do it? Why does it seem like only the U.S. can play this role effectively?
It's abundantly clear, first off, that Israel and Iran themselves can't talk directly. Decades of intense hostility, no diplomatic ties. They simply possess no reliable direct dialogue channels. This makes international mediation not just helpful, but absolutely necessary for any progress.
What about Europe? Germany, France? They tried, didn't they?
They did. European nations, particularly Germany and France, actively sought to mediate during the height of the crisis. Iran's foreign minister met with EU diplomats. French President Macron spoke directly with the Iranian president. But Iran was notably cold to their overtures. They showed very little enthusiasm.
Why not? Why rebuff European efforts?
The fundamental limitation for European nations, from Iran's perspective, seems to be leverage over Israel. Iran perceives, probably correctly, that European countries cannot largely control Israel. And for Iran, any meaningful engagement requires, as a precondition, credible pressure on Israel to restrain its actions. Europe simply lacks that kind of decisive influence over Israeli policy.
Okay, so Europe's out. What about Russia? They used to have decent ties with both sides.
Russia's influence in this specific context has significantly diminished. Their alliance with Iran was always more opportunistic, largely forged during the Syrian civil war, where they shared the goal of propping up the Assad regime. But after Assad's collapse in December 2024, a major geopolitical shift, Russia largely pulled its forces out of Syria,
Focusing on Ukraine.
focusing its resources and attention squarely on Ukraine. This left Iran with little substantive, immediate help from its supposed Russian ally when this crisis erupted.
And relations with Israel cooled, too.
Yes. While personal ties between Putin and Netanyahu existed, and there's a large Russian-speaking population in Israel creating a cultural bond, Russia's deepening alignment with Iran and Syria directly put it at odds with Israel's security interests there. Furthermore, Russia's very public lack of immediate vocal support for Israel after the October 7th Hamas attack really displeased Netanyahu and his government.
So Russia lacks the clout and the balance now.
In conclusion, Russia simply lacks the necessary influence, the balanced diplomatic weight, and perhaps even the immediate strategic interest to effectively mediate between Iran and Israel right now. Their focus is elsewhere.
So after ruling out Europe and Russia, it really does seem to come down to the United States as the only power with the potential leverage and engagement from both sides.
Precisely. And this became startlingly clear during the crisis itself. On June 20th, according to reports, Iran's representative directly told EU diplomats quite explicitly that only the U.S. has the power to restrain Israel.
Wow, that's blunt.
Very blunt, and that only the U.S. could effectively organize the kind of international supervision needed for a broader Middle East ceasefire and, crucially, for managing the Iranian nuclear program going forward.
Even after months of failed nuclear talks before this.
Even after 2 months of largely unproductive nuclear talks with the U.S. just prior to this conflict, Iran still seems to believe, perhaps begrudgingly, perhaps pragmatically, that only talks with the U.S. are valuable for achieving any kind of comprehensive, lasting solution.
It underscores the unique, almost indispensable role the U.S. continues to play, whether it wants to or not.
A role no other power currently seems able to replicate in this specific high-stakes context.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly and look inside Iran. Beyond the immediate military and diplomatic fallout, what potential changes or vulnerabilities might we see within the Iranian regime itself following these intense events? Is the regime stable?
It's a key question. Despite the very real military losses Iran sustained and the apparent inability to fully secure its major cities against sophisticated strikes, the Iranian regime currently shows no obvious signs of immediate instability that would suggest an imminent collapse is likely.
What are the signs of resilience?
Well, for instance, high-ranking officials who were assassinated or killed in Israeli or U.S. strikes have generally been replaced within a day or two. This indicates robust and functional personnel appointment procedures are still operating, even under extreme duress.
And government functions continued.
Absolutely. Diplomatic activity continued pretty much unimpeded throughout the most intense airstrikes. The Iranian foreign minister traveled abroad for meetings. The president held calls with European leaders. This demonstrates the government's relatively stable internal functioning. It can still operate effectively even in a major crisis.
How does Iran's unique political structure contribute to this resilience? It seems more durable than some other regional regimes that have faced pressure.
It certainly seems designed for durability. Iran operates on that deeply entrenched dual-track system we talked about. You have the elected executive branch, but alongside it, and ultimately superior, is the powerful religious oversight structure led by the supreme leader.
With checks and balances.
Yes. The system features a series of established checks and balances among its administrative, legislative, and religious powers. Even thinking about the potential death of Supreme Leader Khamenei, he's 86, reportedly in poor health, so succession is a real prospect. There's a constitutional provision for that.
What happens then?
It dictates a collective leadership would take over, comprising the president, the justice minister, and the guardian council. And the Guardian Council itself is an appointed body that undergoes periodic reform. It's not just one person's appointees forever. This complex, multi-layered structure is specifically designed to prevent a collapse just from the loss of a single leader.
Unlike regimes centered entirely on one person, like Saddam's Iraq or Assad's Syria.
Exactly, where the removal of the single figurehead destabilized the entire state apparatus very quickly.
There's also the economic aspect, right? The IRGC's role.
Yes, that's a lesser-known but critical factor in Iran's resilience. The independent financial resources held by key political elite groups, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, they control a vast economic empire.
How so?
Through charitable foundations known as bonyads, various factories making everything from beverages to industrial goods, and even controlling their own oil fields. This allows them to export oil and maintain revenue streams completely outside the central government's direct budget and control.
Which creates inefficiency, surely.
Oh, it leads to significant economic inefficiency and breeds implicit corruption, absolutely. But paradoxically, this decentralization of resources enhances the regime's overall resilience. It means that if one power center or one revenue stream is targeted or sanctioned, the entire system doesn't immediately collapse because various powerful factions have their own independent means of sustenance.
So the system is designed to absorb shocks, even if it's inefficient. But what about the people within that system? You mentioned the rise of hardline military factions due to delegation during the conflict. Does that shift the internal balance of power?
That's a very significant development to watch closely. Remember, after 3 or 4 days of intense Israeli airstrikes, Supreme Leader Khamenei largely moved to a secure bunker. This apparently led to communication disruptions and a de facto delegation of many critical, real-time military decisions like missile launches, target selection down to senior IRGC officers.
See, these officers tend to be hardliners.
They are, by their very nature and career paths within the IRGC, almost uniformly hardline. And here's a crucial, almost paradoxical consequence of years of Western policy.
The assassination.
The continuous U.S. and Israeli targeted assassinations of senior Iranian military figures over the past 5 or 6 years have inadvertently cleared the path for their replacements. And those replacements are precisely the individuals who are most staunchly anti-U.S. and anti-Israel, because that hardline stance is what gains trust and support within the IRGC structure, accelerating their promotion.
So does this increased influence of hardliners automatically mean Iran will be more aggressive or irrational?
Not necessarily irrational. While they are strong in their convictions, these are experienced military officers. Their frontline experience, particularly during this recent conflict, gives them a very clear, pragmatic understanding of Iran's actual military weaknesses, especially its significantly degraded air defense capabilities, which were badly exposed.
But their long-term goals might shift.
That's the concern. In the medium to long term, their increased influence means that Iran's fundamental pursuit of national revival and sanctions relief will likely involve hardline methods and a more assertive posture. Specifically, this could include a stronger push to solidify Iran's nuclear threshold status, meaning having everything ready to quickly assemble a bomb into actual nuclear weapon capability.
As the ultimate deterrent.
They would likely view becoming a nuclear power as the only true guarantee against future Israeli or U.S. attacks, the ultimate security blanket. It's a dangerous logical progression that their growing influence could unfortunately accelerate.
Thinking about regime change, which Israel explicitly mentioned, how successful has external intervention actually been historically in leading to desired political shifts in the Middle East? It seems like a strategy with a poor track record.
It's a very important question, and you're right. Modern Middle Eastern history offers a pretty sobering answer. There are very few successful cases where external military intervention led directly to the desired outcome of regime change and a subsequent shift in political alignment that benefited the intervening power.
The Iraq example looms large.
It does. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 led to Saddam Hussein's fall, certainly. But the new Iraqi government that emerged was hardly friendly to the U.S. in the long run. In fact, the invasion destabilized the country, fueled internal sectarian conflicts, and created the fertile ground for the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, a completely unintended and disastrous consequence.
And Iran's own revolution wasn't external.
Exactly. Iran's own 1978-79 revolution, which overthrew the U.S.-backed Shah and led to the current regime's confrontation with the U.S. and Israel, was a completely spontaneous internal social phenomenon. It wasn't driven by external forces, it welled up from within. These transitions often have dynamics that outsiders can't predict or control.
What about the psychological impact of these recent strikes on ordinary Iranians? Does bombing foster a desire for change that aligns with, say, Israeli or U.S. goals?
It seems highly unlikely. The current Israeli airstrikes, and particularly the powerful Midnight Hammer operation, are undoubtedly causing widespread insecurity, anxiety, and deep fear among ordinary Iranians. That's a natural human response. It is, frankly, quite unrealistic to expect that a change in leadership, especially one perceived as being brought about by external military pressure or bombing, would suddenly lead ordinary Iranians to, thank Israelis or embrace a pro-Western foreign policy.
If anything, it might breed resentment or nationalism.
Historically, such interventions often fuel nationalism and resentment against the aggressor. Samuel Huntington's analysis of 20th century political transitions in his famous work, The Third Wave, backs this up. He found that fewer than 25% of countries that underwent major internal political upheaval and regime change spontaneously adopted U.S.-style political systems or made radical shifts in their core foreign policy alignments.
And Iran sees itself as a major regional player.
Iran has actively sought to project influence and maintain its sovereignty in the Middle East for decades. It's core to its identity post-revolution. Expecting any regime change, however it happens, to magically lead to an alliance with the U.S. and Israel seems highly unlikely. The deep historical, cultural, and political currents run strongly against such an outcome.
Okay, so with all this complex analysis laid out, the fragile ceasefire, the resilient Iranian regime structure, the internal U.S. divisions, the hard lessons of history, what should we be watching for next? What are the critical immediate and longer-term developments that will shape the Middle East going forward?
In the immediate short term, the absolute critical focus is on the U.S.-Iran dynamic, specifically when or if they will resume nuclear talks, and crucially, what happens with Iran's uranium enrichment.
The sticking point from before the conflict.
Exactly. Remember, the previous rounds of talks over 2 months failed, largely because Iran offered to transfer its high-purity enriched uranium for international supervision, but stubbornly insisted on retaining low-purity enrichment capability for what it called normal atomic energy research.
Which the U.S. opposed, fearing it was a loophole.
The U.S. saw it as a potential cover for continued weaponization efforts down the road. So the critical question now, after the shock of Midnight Hammer, is whether Iran will temporarily compromise on that insistence on low-purity enrichment. Will they agree to a full pause? That decision is absolutely crucial for any chance of a sustained ceasefire and for broader political engagement to prevent a renewed crisis erupting in a few months.
Okay, that's the immediate focus. What about the mid to long-term internal stability picture in both Iran and Israel?
Mid to long term, both countries face significant brewing internal political challenges, potentially crises. In Iran, as we discussed, Supreme Leader Khamenei's advanced age, 86, means leadership succession is not a matter of if but when. His personal influence, and that of the broader religious elite, appears to be gradually declining due to Iran's deteriorating international standing and these recent military and nuclear setbacks.
And the succession process is unclear.
The who and how of this upcoming power transition, which could dramatically reshape Iran's future direction, remain entirely unknown outside a very small circle. This creates a substantial degree of internal uncertainty.
And Israel isn't immune from political instability either. Netanyahu's government seems perpetually on edge.
That's entirely accurate. Prime Minister Netanyahu's current government, a coalition of his Likud party, various hard-right factions, and orthodox religious parties, faces significant internal divisions and immense public pressure. Opposition forces are actively seeking to hold him accountable for the security failures surrounding the October 7th Gaza attacks, and there are widespread calls for new elections.
Does he have time?
Theoretically, his government can remain in power until December of next year. And the recent strikes against Iran did provide a temporary boost to his approval ratings, rallying people around the flag. But a year and a half is a very short time in the volatile world of Israeli politics. If the Gaza conflict continues to drag on, if economic and social order aren't fully restored, Netanyahu's tenure remains far from certain. The political ground beneath him is still very shaky.
Finally, let's touch on energy markets. The Middle East, despite all the global shifts in energy production, always seems to be a factor when tensions flare up. What's the current picture after this dramatic escalation? Did prices spike?
Interestingly, not really in a sustained way. The Midnight Hammer operation itself only caused a very temporary half-day spike in global oil prices. Since then, prices have actually fallen back to levels below where they were before the initial Israeli strikes on June 12th.
So no panic in the markets.
Not really. Even at their brief peak, hovering around $75 per barrel, prices were still roughly at the 5-year average. They weren't particularly exaggerated or indicative of a major supply crisis.
Why this stability, given the circumstances?
It's largely due to several factors combining. Global energy demand is relatively low at the moment compared to past peaks, and crucially, global reliance on Middle Eastern oil producers, while still significant, is gradually decreasing due to the rise of other producers like the US, Brazil, Guyana, and efforts towards diversification of supply.
But a wider conflict could still cause problems.
Oh, absolutely. A prolonged, full-scale regional conflict could still severely disrupt supplies. But analysts generally believe that only a scenario where the Strait of Hormuz, that critical narrow waterway for oil tankers, were to be completely blockaded for months, would likely trigger real panic-driven price hikes, pushing prices consistently above $90 per barrel. Short, contained conflicts generally won't lead to sustained price increases like we saw after the 2003 Iraq War or during the 2011 Arab Spring uprising.
And Iran chose not to blockade Hormuz this time.
Right. It's particularly interesting that even with some calls from hardliners within the Iranian parliament to blockade Hormuz in retaliation, the Iranian National Security Council ultimately opted for restraint on that front.
What does that tell us?
It's a critical indicator of internal resilience, but also strategic calculation within the Iranian political system. It highlights that despite the volatility and the deep-seated grievances, there's still a pragmatic, almost cold-blooded assessment of costs versus benefits happening. They likely realized blockading Hormuz would hurt them significantly too and invite massive international intervention.
So the bottom line on energy.
The bottom line is that this incident underscores that despite moments of dramatic tension and increasing global energy diversification, the Middle East still retains immense importance and influence on the world stage, particularly psychologically for energy markets, even as the specific dynamics of that influence continue to evolve.
What an incredible, truly complex dance we've just walked through. Military action, high-stakes diplomatic maneuvering, deeply rooted internal political dynamics, all defining this recent escalation.
It's undeniably clear that while a fragile ceasefire currently holds, the underlying tensions, the core unresolved issues between these powerful regional players, Iran and Israel, with the U.S. deeply involved, remain deeply entrenched, ready, it feels, to flare up again at almost any moment.
Indeed. And it leaves us, as always here on The Deep Dive, with perhaps a provocative thought to carry forward, something to reflect on.
Go ahead.
If both sides, Israel and Iran, genuinely desire some form of security for their nations, for their people, and presumably they do, why do they seem so locked in this perpetual, almost self-defeating cycle of suspicion, mistrust, and escalating conflict?
It's the perennial question.
What level of new thinking, maybe even a fundamental rethinking of what absolute security truly means, and questioning whether it can ever be achieved through military dominance alone without some kind of exit strategy for conflict? What would it truly take for the region to finally break this historical cycle of escalating tensions and profound corrosive mistrust?
Something for you, our listener, to definitely mull over. Consider those enduring historical patterns, the strategic calculations, but also the very human element, the fear, the ambition, the political pressures behind these grand strategic moves that continue to shape our world.